The Nintendo 64 has a notoriously scarce library when it comes to role-playing games. For every surge in expectation, such as the Mother 3 announcement or Final Fantasy before it was moved to the PlayStation, you'd often get the feeling that sooner or later an RPG game announced on the N64 would be cancelled. Yes, there are shining examples such as Paper Mario on the system, but early in the console's lifespan, many of us yearned for an engrossing experience like we had had on the Super Nintendo. Although you could loosely class Shadowgate 64 as an RPG, at the time many publications were pushing this as an RPG, most likely to help garner some attention for gamers looking for that gameplay fix. Personally though, many of us would actually classify this as an adventure game, but whatever your thoughts on its genre are, there's no doubt that Shadowgate 64 is one of the more unique games on the console. Developed by TNS and Infinite Ventures and then published by Kemco in 1999, Shadowgate 64 does all it can to bring a fresh experience to the console, whilst also linking itself to the experience of the original 80s Shadowgate for fans of the first title. Centuries after the first game where Lord Jaed defeated Warlock, Shadowgate 64 sees you re-enter the same kingdom, but with so much time having passed, the actual kingdom has changed somewhat. It's become ravaged with thieves and bandits, and as the game begins you'll see a caravan ambush that kills the peaceful tradesman. This is all except for Del Cottonwood, a halfling whom you take control of throughout the entire game experience. After being captured and taken prisoner by the bandits, you end up in the infamous cells of Castle Shadowgate. This is where you take control in a first person perspective of Del and you test your mental matter against the troublesome castle. Now the first thing that you'll likely notice about the game is the frankly subpar visuals. There's no getting around this, but the console was clearly capable of so much more. The textures themselves are fairly low quality, which is surprising as they are often repeated over and over again as you progress throughout the game. With the vast majority of the game taking place inside cramped and dingy walkways and rooms, it's hard to justify the lack of clarity here. What emphasises this further is that by the very nature of the game, there's very little action taking place on screen at any given time. Whereas first-person shooters need the console's power to power enemy movement and AI, think of this like a first-person point-and-click game. You do not have to avoid fast-paced enemies or worry about quickly firing off your weapons, and so there's nothing here that's really putting any kind of strain on the system's capabilities. Saying that though, there's something that I really dig about the visuals. The dark and grainy textures really help this game feel in place with the dirty medieval style setting. Nothing you look at or see or actually feel in the game comes across with a warm feeling. This is an extremely atmospheric game, and when you combine the gloomy, depressing look with the sense of claustrophobia, it gives a fantastic setting. When playing the game however, I do honestly believe that you'll either love or loathe the gameplay. With very little actual action taking place, this really is a game for those of you watching who prefer puzzle solving and logic. But speaking of logic, like most puzzle style adventure games, there are many instances where logic is thrown out of the window, and you'll often simply use much trial and error to eventually find something that works. For example, early on in the game you will acquire a pickaxe, and shortly thereafter you'll come across a crumbling wall. Now common sense would tell you to pick up the pickaxe and smash through the wall to make a hole. However, the pickaxe is actually used in another location to help you reach a higher ledge. These moments can sometimes slow the game down to a crawl, especially in the later parts of the game where things become more complex. But if you reach that far, then you'll most likely already be hooked on the game. Another frustration for many will be the one mistake game over screens, and there's many unique ways which you can die in the game. Naturally, you'll want to save as frequently as possible, as many times you'll fall into a false sense of security even if you feel you're in the most safest location. Throughout the game you'll also find hundreds of books, and you'll really need to spend time reading them to not only fill out the game's backstory, but also to help you with clues to the puzzles. There are at times also other characters you come across, from villagers to ghosts, and so listen to their words wisely, as without them you can end up getting stuck for hours. There are many supernatural elements to the game which once again help to bring the experience a little more life, although I do wish that there were more characters to interact with at times in this frequently lonely experience. Perhaps my favourite element of the game is the fantastic music, which surprised me as from reading reviews of the time this was often commented on merely as passable. Like the main game itself, I found it to be quite unique, and although not the best quality, it does feel particularly in keeping with the game's tones. It's a really hard soundtrack to describe, but if you think of period movies, you couldn't go far wrong. You have things like mandolins and organic symphonies which accompany your exploration in the towers. Most importantly, I never found out that the music would get distracting even if you're stuck in the most difficult areas for a prolonged period of time. And some of the pieces of music will have you humming along if you allow yourself to focus on it. I also believe that the effects are done very well and are used frequently throughout the game. Whether it's the flicker of pages as you pick up books, the sound of tables randomly being flipped over by poltergeists, or simply the eerie footsteps you make as you traverse the game's towers. Shadowgate 64 is one of the more underrated and lesser spoken of titles on the console. Perhaps this can be down to the extremely limited production run the game went through. With around 70,000 copies being made worldwide, it's not one which you come across that often. Saying that though, there are some big differences in terms of the number of copies in different regions. The English language PAL version is the most rare and highly sought after by collectors, so be careful not to pick up the European PAL version which doesn't contain English text, as many unsavoury resellers will try to cover up knowingly that they have a European copy. I've seen eBay sellers put fake stickers on the cover saying that the game is English language, or completely ignoring questions from anyone questioning them whether the copy they're selling is the PAL English version or the PAL European version. For the rest of the world though, you shouldn't have a problem in being able to pick up the game. With tight controls, an interesting storyline and excellent atmosphere, Shadowgate 64 is a great bridge between the previous generation and the time when the game was released. Yes, it doesn't push the console even close to its capabilities, but what it lacks in visuals and action, it certainly makes up for in a challenging and engrossing experience. A follow-up title called Shadowgate Rising was in development for the console, but it was ultimately cancelled as the studio simply ran out of time and realised that the GameCube would be released by the time they could finish the game. It was due to take place centuries after Shadowgate 64 and would feature a female lead character going up against the power of Cal Torlin once again. It's unlikely that we will ever see a developer cart leak of Shadowgate Rising, as the studio were actually developing the game on PC and using N64 emulators to test it rather than burning cartridges each time to play on the actual hardware. The PC version too was also cancelled shortly after the N64 version, and so we can only look at these screenshots and dream as to what may have came from a late version of Shadowgate Rising, really pushing the N64 console to its limits. But as always, those are just my thoughts and I'd love to know yours. Do you prefer the NES original, or like me, did you find something compelling about this peculiar N64 game? For those who like this game, I'd also like to know what improvements you were hoping for when the sequel was announced back in the day. As always, let's have a discussion in the comments section down below, and until next time.